there. I want to take a little bit of time today to supplement what your textbook has to say about the Cold War, just to add a little bit more detail, because we're going to have to go through this fairly quickly in class. We're going to condense a whole bunch of stuff into one or two lessons, so I think that a little bit more content might be helpful. I'm going to talk a little bit about causes of the Cold War, about the story of its origins, and then I'll talk about a few examples of Cold War conflicts and effects of the Cold War, in addition to what you can find in your textbook. So let's start with causes. There is, as with basically everything I teach in this class, a huge amount of historical scholarship by people much smarter and better informed than me about exactly why the Cold War shows up, but a few basic causes that you probably want to be able to explain. The most obvious, I suppose, is the ideological differences between the United States and the Soviets. The Americans are going to phrase the Cold War, they're going to cast the Cold War as being a contest between communism and democracy, or communism and freedom, or in some cases, communism, which is sort of the official atheism of the Soviet Union, and the godly behavior of the United States. So there's a bunch of different ways of phrasing this, but those ideological differences are, of course, the foundation of the Cold War. And you can see the Soviets taking kind of the opposite position and framing it in ways that's much more friendly to their own interpretation of events. But there's also, a lot of those ideological differences had existed since the Russian Revolution of 1917. And so we also have to think about why those powers, were able to cooperate for the duration of the Second World War. And so we also need to explain why that relatively cooperative relationship is suddenly going to pivot into just tremendous tension and almost conflict after 1945. And the answer to that question really has a lot more to do with geopolitical, strategic, territorial ambitions, specifically in Eastern Europe. After the surrender of the Nazis in 1945, after the downfall of Germany and the end of the war in Europe, there's going to be some really significant competition for territory in Europe, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a minute. But both the United States and the Soviet Union, as well as the other major Allied powers in World War II, are going to have fairly concrete views about what ought to happen with the territory that had been occupied by the Nazis and then liberated by various Allied armies. And so the competition over those specific, the reconstruction of governments in those countries is going to be kind of the staging ground for these conflicts between the Soviets and primarily the Americans. There's also a few specific disagreements that had emerged during and immediately after World War II, where the Americans will feel that the Soviets have broken their promises and vice versa. And that's also going to fuel tension between those two countries. Stalin, towards the very end of World War II, makes this promise to the other Allied powers that he plans to hold free and fair elections in the territories that are occupied by the Soviet Red Army at the end of the war, and he doesn't do that. And so there is some resentment about broken promises there. FDR during the war, and then later Truman, will pester and pester and pester the Soviets to go to war against Japan, which is a theater in which the United States has been bearing the brunt of most of the fighting on the Allied side. And Stalin will delay and delay and delay. He actually doesn't invade Japan in the form of its Manchurian colony in northern China until August 9th, 1945, which is to say until the very end of the war. The Soviets, meanwhile, are deeply, deeply suspicious that the United States has been developing an atomic military capacity, an atomic bomb, without disclosing this fully to the Soviet Union. And the Soviets have a fair amount of intelligence that keeps them up to date on the progress of the American nuclear program. But the American failure to actually tell the Soviets about much of this is obviously going to cause Stalin to start to believe that maybe the Americans are planning to use that to threaten him as well as to threaten the Axis powers. And so for these and a number of other reasons, after the end of World War II, after that common cause of fighting the Axis powers goes away, you're going to see tensions emerge and become kind of the dominant force in global politics between the Americans and their allies versus the Soviets and their allies. These two powers are going to engage in two major strategies, to paint it with a fairly broad brush, in order to pursue their respective aims during World War, or after World War II, in the early years of the Cold War. The Soviet strategy, not in their terms, but in the terms of a lot of historians of the Cold War, will describe for our purposes here as expansionism. Russia and then the Soviet Union after it have had a fair number of experiences of being invaded from the West. And so one of their major strategic goals after the end of World War II is to create a buffer zone of friendly states to their west, between them and particularly Germany, that can serve as a defensive barrier in the event of any conflict. And so their major goal in Eastern Europe after the war is going to be to install friendly governments in a bunch of the states to their west in Eastern Europe. So in the years after the war, the Soviets will use a variety of methods to create satellite states in Eastern Europe. And that term refers to the fact that those states are technically independent and legally sovereign, but under a significant degree of Soviet influence. Those other states that are colored in this pinkish red on the map are governed by communist parties, and leaders of those communist parties in general are going to be fairly responsive to the wishes of the Soviet leadership. And at various points later during the Cold War, the Soviets won't hesitate to send in the troops if there's any threat to the sovereignty of those communist parties in those satellite states. So they're technically independent, but they are allied with the Soviet Union. The major exception, by the way, is Yugoslavia, which is governed by a self-proclaimed socialist party, predominantly under the leadership of a guy named Tito, but which is actually going to make a very definitive break with the Soviet Union. Militarily, the vehicle for Soviet expansionism is called the Warsaw Pact, which is a mutual defense treaty signed in 1955 between the Soviet Union and many of its satellite states. On the flip side, the American policy, and this is an American term, is known as containment. This is articulated first by, and most famously, by a diplomat named George Kennan, who has a lot of experience in Soviet politics, at least by American standards, in 1946 and 47. And what he says is essentially, we don't need to go into the Soviet Union and try to take down the communist government. We just need to restrict the expansion of Soviet influence, and eventually, over the course of time, Bolshevik communist power will fall in the Soviet Union. That's Kennan's basic philosophy. And so under that rubric, the United States is going to implement a number of policies that, at least according to the American government, are designed to restrict the expansion of Soviet influence. One of those policies is the Truman Doctrine, articulated by President Harry Truman in 1947, when the United States feels a need to step in order to defend governments in Turkey and in Greece against various threats of communist insurrection. And so the Truman Doctrine says that the U.S. is going to provide military aid to governments that face any kind of communist insurgency or threat from within. The second major piece of policy under the Truman administration is called the Marshall Plan. It's named after Secretary of State George Marshall, who announces this policy in the commencement address at Harvard University in 1948. Harvard undergraduates have never since then been satisfied with the importance of their commencement speaker. What Marshall says is that the United States will launch this ambitious program of giving economic aid to help rebuild the economies of European countries that have been physically devastated by World War II. And so on the face of it, this is really sort of a humanitarian or an economic gesture, but it has kind of obvious political implications in terms of those countries' presumed debt of loyalty to the United States after receiving Marshall Plan aid. Militarily, the expression of the American military bloc is going to be known as NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the capitalist equivalent of the Warsaw Pact. Again, those states will be bound together by a treaty commitment to defend each other in the event of a military attack by a foreign power, and that's pretty clearly directed at the Soviet Union. NATO, by the way, persists even after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 and remains an important organization for a number of countries to coordinate their military policy to this day. Your textbook gives you a few examples of ways in which the Cold War goes into practice, of conflicts and of policies that are implemented in the course of this strategic rivalry between the US and the Soviets. I'm just going to talk about a couple of others. One of the really early conflicts of the Cold War comes in 1948 in the form of an event known as the Berlin Crisis. And to explain this, we have to back up again to the post-World War II settlement, which is true with most of the events of the early Cold War. After World War II, Germany is divided into four zones and occupied by the four major Allied powers. The British get a zone in the northwest, the French get a zone in the southwest, the Americans get a zone in the southeast, and the Soviets get a zone in the northeast. Berlin, the capital, is located pretty squarely within the Soviet zone, but is viewed as being too symbolically important to just hand over to the Soviets entirely. And so Berlin itself is also subdivided into four zones of occupation. Pretty soon after that division, the Americans, the British, and the French are going to merge their respective zones of the country, and the division will boil down to a capitalist West Germany and a communist Soviet-influenced East Germany. In 1948, Joseph Stalin orders a blockade of West Berlin. He cuts off all transport links between West Germany and West Berlin, essentially in the hopes of coercing the citizens of West Berlin to accept Soviet sovereignty, or rather East German sovereignty, to allow themselves to be incorporated into the Soviet orbit. So he cuts off all the road and rail links. And this is one of the early exercises of containment because Harry Truman of the United States decides he's not going to go to war with the Soviet Union. He's not going to send in military force to attempt to force back open those ground links between West Germany and West Berlin. Instead, the United States and the British will respond with an operation called the Berlin Airlift, or in very 1940s American slang, Operation Vittles, where they fly, they use their cargo air capacity. They use the Air Force to fly in supplies of food and coal and heating oil and so forth to the citizens of West Berlin. So this persists for several months until Stalin eventually decides to abandon the blockade. It's a major propaganda coup for the United States. You can find all kinds of old-timey newsreels about how great the American and British pilots are for helping and saving the people of West Berlin. And this is an early example of containment in action. There are a number of events throughout the Cold War known as proxy wars. We use the term Cold War to describe this period of history because there's never a literal shooting war, or hot war as it's called, between the US and the Soviets. But that doesn't mean that the Cold War is casualty-free. And in fact, there are a huge number of people outside the US and the Soviet Union who die as a result of this conflict in violent ways. So there's a number of examples of these. Your textbook talks about the Korean War, which starts in 1950, a Soviet-sponsored communist government in North Korea, which has also been divided after World War II ends, is going to invade an American-sponsored government in South Korea. The South Koreans, with the support of the United States under the auspices of the United Nations, will push back. At this point, once the front lines of the war are pushed almost to the border between Korea and China, newly communist China will start to feel that its interests are threatened. China will send troops. The line of conflict will be pushed back to essentially where the war started, and the war is going to stalemate by 1953. That's the root of the contemporary division between North and South Korea. Similarly, in Vietnam, there's another North-South division. There's another communist-sponsored government in the North, another American-sponsored government in the South. There's another northern invasion of the South. The United States is going to commit more and more and more troops. And this is actually, over the course of time, going to have serious political and social repercussions in the United States as Americans, particularly in the late 1960s, start wondering what it is that they're doing being drafted to go fight in Vietnam. And so if you're interested in the social and the cultural impacts of the Cold War more than the political and military impacts, the impact of the Vietnam War in the United States is a really good case study if you're interested in that sort of thing. That's going to end with an American withdrawal and a North Vietnamese victory. A lesser known example is a war in Angola that starts in 1975 and actually continues up until 2002. Angola in West Africa has been, or Southwest Africa, I suppose, has been colonized by the Portuguese, and after a lengthy armed struggle, they achieve independence in 1975. But as is the case with a lot of newly independent countries, they can't necessarily agree on how to govern themselves. And so there are three different political groups that separate out in Angola based on lines of both political ideology and ethnic identity. The Americans support one group, the Soviets support another group, and the Chinese support a third group, providing financial aid, providing intelligence, and providing them access to arms sales. Cuba and South Africa get involved, sending support to various sides, and the result is an incredibly bloody and violent and brutal civil war that persists for a very long time, even after the end of the Cold War itself. Last example I want to talk about is in Nicaragua, so moving over to Central America. A leftist group known as the Sandinistas are going to take power in Nicaragua in 1979. And one of the things that they'll do is start nationalizing certain sectors of the economy, bringing it under the control of the government. The United States, particularly once the Reagan administration comes to power, will see the Sandinistas as a threat to political stability and as perhaps the beachhead of a bigger communist invasion of Central America, which is a region which the United States has for a long time claimed a particular strategic interest. And so the CIA starts funding a bunch of anti-Sandinista, anti-leftist rebel groups who are variously known as the Contras. The United States Congress specifically bans this aid because the Contras, among other problems, have been accused of a huge number of human rights abuses in their war against this leftist government. And the Reagan administration responds by illegally selling arms to Iran, which is involved in a totally separate conflict, taking that money and secretly funneling it to these Contra groups. That's where the Iran-Contra scandal comes from. The result is, again, an incredibly bloody civil war, a long legacy that even after the war ends in 1988, that will persist of distrust, of instability, and that's going to be a pretty clear example of the ways in which proxy wars can have effects even after the Cold War ends. Last example I want to talk about is the Afghan-Soviet War. Afghanistan has a domestic communist party take power in the late 1970s, but by 1979, the Soviet Union is starting to become concerned that that communist government isn't going to be able to keep power, and so there's more and more infighting among members of the Afghan government. There's more and more threat to the power of communist control in Afghanistan, and so in 1979, the Soviet Union sends in troops to try and prop up its favorite faction, the Afghan government. The United States senses an opportunity, and very famously, National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski in the Carter administration is going to write this memo that says, well, if we play our cards right, this could be an opportunity for us to do to the Soviets what we think they did to us in Vietnam. The goal is to bog down the Soviets in a difficult, complicated war that will sap their morale and use up a whole bunch of their money and military resources. And so the result is a CIA operation called Operation Cyclone. The CIA is going to work with various Pakistani and Saudi intermediaries to try and funnel money to mujahideen, or freedom fighters, who are opposed to the Soviets in Afghanistan. And the US will maintain that support for about 10 years until the Soviets withdraw in 1989. It's worth noting that the civil war in Afghanistan, in the Afghan-Soviet War and after, is incredibly complex. The United States doesn't actually have a ton of capacity on the ground, and so doesn't have a huge amount of control over where this money ends up. And we'll double back to this in a couple of weeks. There is an argument, a somewhat plausible argument, that some of that money will eventually end up funding groups that go on after the Soviets withdraw to be hostile to the United States, thereby suggesting that when you intervene in a country's complex politics, perhaps you can't control the entire outcome. But we'll get there in a little bit later. The U.S. does, in the shorter term, succeed in bogging the Soviets down in Afghanistan, although it's not 100% clear that American aid is the only factor leading to the difficulty of that war for the Soviets. The Soviets finally withdraw in 1989, and Afghanistan then descends into civil war. There's a lot of other examples of ways in which the Cold War is going to affect global politics, as well as the economy, society, culture. But I will stop it there for now, and we'll talk about this more when I see you next. Thanks.